Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 35th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Its title being Circumstances which attend the application of the means of strategy. The text follows. These circumstances are country and ground, the former including the territory and inhabitants of the whole theater of war. So this is also a very brief paragraph in which von Clausewitz fundamentally shows all those circumstances that accompany the employment of the means of strategy. And interestingly enough, these actually parallel the circumstances which always attend the application of the means in war for building a theory of the art of war that are in fact the locality, the time of the day, and weather, right? So these are always present, of course, also in strategy and in the way the application of its means are attended. So quite simply, as we have just read, these circumstances are country and ground, the former including the territory and inhabitants of the whole theater of war. This is very important because this is not just, in fact, as we were saying also in the 31st paragraph, here we're not talking just about terrain. We're actually talking of every physical dimension that extends on the surface of this territory and the people that inhabit it, right? So country meant literally as as a space that is populated, that is put into function. By the way, this is very important, as we will see, for also drawing resources from the territory, from the country itself. And then there is also this more, let's say, environmental dimension, this proper terrain as such, as what it means to invade a country that I don't know has a specific, I don't know, it's a mountainous country, for example, or it's a flatland, or it's covered in forests, right? So these are all factors that are taken into consideration and that are always there. So you can't exclude it. Here, the country could be theoretically even inhabited area, right? The dishabited area, and I know you say that. It doesn't necessarily include people, but it's obvious that a country overall at that point has an impact on the application of the means of strategy, because strategy has to take into consideration how to support the armed forces with the aim of attaining a tactical victory. So where to make them fight, and naturally the ways you have this means being sustained is for achieving that is gonna have an enormous influence overall. There is here the time of the day, right? Next, the time of the day and the time of the year as well, and this is also what we remembered in the 32nd paragraph when we were talking, in fact, about that. We were saying, I was wondering things like, I don't know whether von Clausewitz is meaning here like the time of the day specifically meant as just the 24 hours or something broader. Well, it's of course how this changes the whole equation in terms of in relation, for example, with the season, and how this influences in terms of light specifically, or in other characteristics that are related chiefly to visibility, but not exclusively, let's say. And in fact, lastly, the weather that von Clausewitz separates in here. The season at that point has, in the time of the day, has nothing to do with the weather proper, right? It's obviously connected, because all these three circumstances are interconnected. They are always interconnected, but here von Clausewitz naturally separates them for the sake of observing them as factors that constantly accompany the applications of the means of strategy. So something that can't be bypassed, right? and even if interacting the one with the other is always there. It's not just like, you know, having an enemy, for example. Or better, yes, in this military context, technically yes, but these are factors that are actually always there, even when strategy, let's say, is still at a planning form, right? And as we've seen, there are many suspensions of the act of war that at that point are, even depending on which scale you want to consider them, they can be part of a broader conflict that, yeah, maybe doesn't see war in every single moment throughout its existence, but still is reasoning in terms of war, in the sense of, you know, if I have to invade this country, what do I have to do, when even if war is still not here, right? And in fact, lastly, the weather, particularly von Clausewitz says, any unusual state of the same, such as severe frost, etc. Right? So all those factors that, and we have discussed this in the 33rd paragraph, are you know, sensibly gonna make a difference eventually in the application of the means of strategy, right? If it rains, strategy essentially doesn't change. Even if it snows lightly, your strategy basically doesn't change. If there is severe frost, well, at that point strategy starts changing substantially, and it has to take that into consideration, albeit we have to also to stress that, as we were saying before, all of these three circumstances combined together can really make an enormous difference, right? For example, take Russia, that is renownedly not a very easy country to invade. And think about spring, right? When all the ice melts and basically certain areas turn into a marshland, right? At that point, maybe it has nothing to do with the weather as such. It has to do with the terrain, but it has to do also with the weather in as a consequence maybe of former severe frost that at that point, combined with the terrain and ice melting, is in itself is creating certain conditions for which it's very difficult, also strategically speaking, to do certain things, like advancing a certain area, right? You know, think about, these are really important things. Think about, I don't know, just think about Teutonic Prussia and how they were in the hinterland of the Baltic countries. Certain areas you basically couldn't venture in because it was like a labyrinth of ways that were cut off when eventually there could be a flood or, you know, ice melt, and there were only specific times in the year where you could pass through certain area, and if you remained enclosed within certain places, you literally starved to death, because basically there wasn't much of a way to sustain an army, etc. And this impacts strategy. So here we have seen that in that case, the weather proper is not even the coast. This is more pertaining to the terrain, but still the weather, I mean, is part of the cause, but not as a direct agent, because, I don't know, there's bad weather simply because it rains, right? That's not going to change much. But combined with a muddy terrain, terrain that becomes muddy with rain, well, that can make a substantial difference. Always given, of course, that certain things are equal for everybody. So also the myth that, I don't know, there are peoples that are kind of supermen because they live in a certain country that has certain characteristics is garbage. Humans are all the same, and frost is for everybody. The problem is how we organize politically, socially, and militarily accordingly. For example, which is a different thing. Not even Soviet Russia was prepared to frost before getting into the winter war with Finland, for example. So stereotypically speaking, not even the Russians knew before then. That helped them much during Operation Barbarossa, because they had learned in a very hard way the lesson of frost, and having developed means to cope with that more effectively than they had done before. So never underestimate, this is just a drop like of strategical history. Maybe we will deal with this in more specific videos, but it's important to stress that in this particular case, these factors, aside from how they can get combined, and von Clausewitz is never interested in telling you, by which degree, because that pertains to the reality, the relative reality, right? This is reality always, right? It doesn't matter which condition you are, you always have to take into consideration country and ground, the time of the day, and weather, right? These are fundamental. They are three elements that do not make strategy as such, but are always present, right? And you can't do as if they aren't there. And we will see, in fact, in the next paragraph, how these circumstances form new means. And actually, we will discuss in part also what we hinted at in this specific videos, right? We're making these examples of rain with mud and with terrain and turning to mud and all these things. Yeah, I think we can stop in here as well. Also the last paragraph was actually produced a very short video here because objectively there's not much to add at this point. These paragraphs are very consequential. Some of them are, like in this case, in part repeating certain concepts that we have seen before, right? But these steps eventually, as we will see, especially from the next paragraphs, form kind of combined, form new concepts that are always very, very, very important to bear in mind, right? And always remember that these are useful notions. They're not anecdotal. They are part of a whole theory. The other day I was reading an article written not really against von Clausewitz, but essentially stating that all of these notions do not seem to be like to... the article was very long. I didn't even have time to finish its conclusions, but complaining about the fact that this is a kind of uncolored manual, and according to me that article was falling into the same mistake of considering the Vom Kriege and what we can learn from it as literally being told what we have to do on the field. Nobody can do that. If you have studied the Vom Kriege, it tells you literally that you need direct experience of what is going on, and that as we have seen in the whole first book, and now in the second, we are observing how we essentially can't predict what the hell is going on, and this is the most important element of what a theory of the art of war is built upon, right? If you get that like a failure, is basically reverting back to those military theorists who pretended to draw a positive theory of the art of war by starting building a theory on material aspects that are kind of undetached from the actual reality, because the more you substantiate them, and actually the more they elude what the situation that you can find yourself in front. So von Clausewitz is very important philosophically speaking, he said, because it really makes you understand that the most practically, strictly and exclusively practically useful thing you can do is to acknowledge that you can't predict those things, because that's literally what is going to happen where you're on the field. And whoever stops doing that it's the equivalent of picking flowers under enemy fire. It's completely useless, if not harmful, right? So von Clausewitz is a really sophisticated thinker. Many people see it like, but he's stating at the end of the day things that seem inconclusive, right? That was a point the article was saying. What does that change, right? The title, you can read that actually, is something, the continuous irrelevance of von Clausewitz, something like that. I would write something, the continuous irrelevance of von Clausewitz detractors. I would be a much more effective text that points out, in my opinion, the what happens all the times. You get criticism towards this theory that essentially they haven't even read it. They haven't even tried to make the effort to say, okay, but how this can help us, and that is quite easy to do, especially if you don't actually study it. If you pretend you just read it and to use it as a manual, that von Clausewitz would be rolling in his grave, right? He was writing this exactly to do the very exact opposite. You can't be searching for that information in that regard in the Vom Kriege. It's not what it's designed for, and it can't be interpreted like that. But at the same time, there is let's say, this double track that you should always bear in mind, that is essentially relative to the fact that this text should accompany rather a person who either is to fight a war for real and or studying military history, because at the end of the day, that's what von Clausewitz really tells you here. He tells you, if you don't get an experience of war, either by direct experience of command or on studying the reports, the accounts of war, you can't fully understand how this really works, right? You can read my theory, but you will not basically get how useful it can be. And that's really probably one of the reasons why so many thinkers and commentators and theorists, etc., have been critical of such ideas, because up to the point you don't need and I don't want to say that there are not military historians, of course, that didn't criticize von Clausewitz. Think about Kagan, think about Lil Hart. These were kind of prominent military historians, actually not always good, because that's also a real point. They're essentially and there is I don't want to refer specifically to these scholars, but there is an attitude when studying military history today, it is more like making a quest for an actor, like for that specific commander, for that specific context, to prove that, I don't know, one commander was superior to another, that was more effective. Nobody wants an explanation that puts in discussion things. You want to get to a solution, right? There is way to do that, historically speaking, because and incidentally, the best one, in my opinion, is what von Clausewitz does, right? And what I also got inspired by. I didn't start writing the things I write because I want to prove that, I don't know, a commander is cool, or that specific military context is special. I want to understand really what happened, for what we can sense and reconstructing something that we know was there, that we know was real, that left traces of itself, and that function in a particular way. And we have to surrender to the fact that certain things are unknown, because they were essentially unknown to the very people who participated into them, and they are unknown also to those who of course came later, like us, and that we have to surrender to the idea that there can't be a real answer to this. We can't get the truth, but we can get at least a part of this picture that makes sense, because we can accompany it to others, as a matter of fact, that we have already observed somewhere else, and that we know more or less that humans fight in a certain way, and that can help us in this regard to suggest what's going on. And instead, I think history is in part really let's say partisan, let's say this actual meaning, because of essentially because of people are moved by sort of course, personal I, bias, but at the same time, they're not moved by an actual interest for what really happened, but for what they wished had happened, right? I personally, I didn't write excessively much in my life yet at a kind of a professional level. But every time I did it, it wasn't for, I don't know, praising someone or something or a country or a people or a part of history. Of course, that happens at the end of the day. You want to point out, for example, the best of certain civilizations because it's objectively interesting, but not pretending that it's because of that specific of an intrinsic character that differentiates itself like an X factor from all the others. Like it's simply different combinations in a system that essentially was all the same. Like if other say better that always changes, that is always different in this regard, but because it's exactly at that point that you can start highlighting things in common in over which there are these, on the top of which there are these this superficial differences, if you want, that are also deeply rooted in part, but still in systems that are fundamentally similar. And this is probably what also why von Clausewitz has never been of excessive appeal, because he somewhat tells you that there is not even a point to pretend that such a serious interest like finding out what happened militarily speaking in certain contexts is to be driven by other hopes of glory, of finding out something special, of celebrating, but simply of trying to understand. Von Clausewitz is extremely stern and extremely fair when it comes to military historical realizations. He was a military historian himself, but a pretty damn good one. And he fundamentally realized at that point the importance of concreteness over let's say celebration, over political motives that indeed at the time, also from a historiographical point of view, were important, right? There was a real concern. Think about even his master, let's say his mentor, let's say better, Scharnhorst, who wrote an enormous work that eventually would change the same history of Europe because of the foundation of the Prussian, the modern Prussian military, say, of the 19th century, pointing out why did the French achieve what they did during Napoleonic Wars, why did Prussia got obliterated by the French, and why this system was pretty damn effective. And this starts from an actual scientific interest. It's not about wondering this as if, that was just a gentle aristocratic party. Let's say gentle, maybe not, but at least in surface, like it had been Ancien Regime warfare during the 18th century. That was a war that had wiped out the major nations of the time for actually creating nations as such, as nationalistically speaking, but at that point requiring a real response that had changed everything on the table, and that would change, in fact, everything on the table forever up to now, because we still live fundamentally within what the French Revolution has created, for better, for worse. And the major difficulty in this process was, in fact, trying to detach this from a kind of from a subjective view, from even an amatorial view, right? That would continue for countries that objectively got militarized very late in time. Think about also the United States, right? Up to World War II, basically the U.S. didn't have armed forces as the other countries. It was a completely different thing. But how this brought eventually to radically re-alter the whole vision of the world. The Vom Kriege is not just like a method, a theory. It's literally seeing the world now through a lens that allows you to interact with it effectively, right? That is the real thing. That is what objectively changed everything forever, and that's why also von Clausewitz has become so debated, because many people have seen in him even the one who furnished the essentially the intellectual tools to powers like, in fact, like Prussia, like eventually even actually the Soviet Union, because this essentially von Clausewitz, the Leninist tradition was totally a Clausewitzian one from terms of military culture. Eventually, there are many, of course, actors that have done not very nice things overall, and that have drawn from von Clausewitz, and that, however, achieved success exactly because they had understood von Clausewitz, and that passed through politics and through military affairs, of course, at the same time. But now we don't digress. Maybe I will have to make a dedicated video to this, because I discussed these things from such a long time now. I haven't quite explained to you how what I'm actually hinting at, but we'll have to do it. Okay, so I would stop it here for now, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.